Well, welcome to Old Testament Survey Session 7, where we're going to talk about the exile and the return. You might recall from our previous session that Judah was now in exile in Babylon. And so as a result, it's important to convey that some would stay and some would go. Not everyone went to Babylon. The Babylonians exiled anyone of value or anyone of potential value to Babylon. This included the youth, artisans, craftsmen, scholars, etc. You name it. Anyone that could add value to the Babylonian economy was taken to Babylon. Whereas the elderly were allowed to remain in the land. Also because the Babylonians didn't think they had much to offer, plus they were too old to mount some form of resistance. And for those, though, some people didn't want to go. Some people were adamant that they needed to go somewhere else, that they needed to resist Babylon. But God made it clear through His prophets, namely through Jeremiah, that He desired His people to go to Babylon for 70 years. And yet, some of these people resisted and fled to Egypt. And a last-ditch hope to maybe use the Egyptians to reclaim their land. This group kidnapped Jeremiah, and he was taken by them, even though he predicted their destruction and the futility of their effort. And so God then will use the exile to break His people from idolatry and to give the land a Sabbath rest that it should have had all along. Now, it's important to draw a point with this. When we go back to the Levitical laws, every seventh year, the land was to get a Sabbath rest. They were to let the crops go fallow and live off of that, but also within that, trust in the Lord. Trust in the Lord to provide. Because when you don't plant crops, how are we going to make a living? How are we going to eat? And this was a way for them to see God show up. But as far as what we can tell in the text, the Israelites never did that. And so God said, not only is your idolatry not okay, you have not honored me. And so I'm going to give the land the Sabbath rest that it needs. You must go off to Babylon. And those who were faithful to God went and didn't resist. So while exiled in Babylon, even in the midst of this exile, it is apparent that God is working and providing spokespeople for the Israelites. We'll speak about Ezekiel when we get to the prophetic section, but for now we're going to concentrate on Daniel. You might recall that Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their Babylonian names, were faithful to God instead of doing what the Babylonians desired. This showed up when it came to diet, where they get to Babylon and the Babylonians are like, we want to fatten you up. We want you to eat as we eat. But Daniel and his friends said, no, these go against the law of Moses. If you would let us eat as we are called to eat, we will be just as fine. And God did show up, and they did do as God called them to. And as a result, the Babylonians were impressed. And so they allowed them to continue to follow the eating habits that Yahweh had passed on to His people. Daniel also interpreted 2 dreams of Nebuchadnezzar's, while he also interpreted the writing on the wall. And so thus Daniel gains more and more notoriety in Babylon as an exile, as someone who really should have had no cachet. He begins to climb the ranks, and people recognize in Babylon that he is a force to be reckoned with. He even survives being thrown into a den of lions. Again, these are stories that you are likely familiar with. And these occur in the opening chapters of Daniel. Also, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will survive death by fire for refusing to worship the statue. And so when they throw them into the fire, you might recall that they're walking around the fire. They should be dead. The guy who threw them into the fire dies. I don't know. It's kind of one of those things. He immediately dies. They don't. That should have tipped people off. But then as they're walking in the fire, there turns out to be a 4th person who is there. We don't know who this 4th person is. Could be an angel of the Lord. But we see that they come out of the fire, and with that, the Babylonians see that Yahweh has power. Again, Yahweh is not a regional deity. His power exists wherever His people are. He is limitless in where He can exercise His strength. There is also new leadership, because Daniel's interpretation of the writing on the wall predicts the fall of the Babylonians to the Persians that very night. And so, as with Assyria, God judged Babylon for its excesses and its sinfulness through the Persians. What happens is God allowed the Assyrians to knock out the Israelites because of their sin. But the Assyrians went well above and beyond what God desired. And so God allows the Babylonians to judge those excesses. And in turn, the Babylonian excesses are judged by the Persians. God will use the Persians then to protect His people and later bankroll them when they return to Jerusalem. And so once again, man's sinfulness, man's brokenness does not limit what God can do or who He can use to do His bidding. And so God's judgment upon the Babylonians through the Persians is a reminder to us that everyone will be called to account. So a call is issued out to go home, because the Persian king Cyrus will decree not only religious tolerance, he will decree that Judah can go home. Isaiah predicted this in Isaiah 44:28, where back before the exile even happened, back in the latter part of the kingdom of Judah, he predicts that after the exile that God will restore Jerusalem through Cyrus. And so Judah will go home in three waves. The first return will be under Zerubbabel. What a name. Just love that name. And he will return in 537 BC. We see this show up in Ezra chapter 1 through chapter 6. So Zerubbabel, along with Sheshbazzar and 50,000 Jews, will return and rebuild the temple and reinstitute the law of Moses. Yet their building will not be welcomed by all. In fact, it will be stopped halfway through by local opposition of those who were left behind in the exile. You might be wondering, who are these people? Well, these would have been people who would have intermarried with the Assyrians, so people from Israel who would have intermarried with the Assyrians during their conquering, or people from surrounding nations nearby. Many of these folks will be the precursor or the forerunners to the Samaritans. And so because of their willingness, because of their stopping of the building of the temple, you can see how later this will build animosity between the Samaritans and the Jews. But Yahweh will not be stopped, because Yahweh will intercede when Darius, Cyrus's successor, when his men find official sanction in the records to build the temple. It's one of these things, again, where Yahweh shows up in amazing ways that we don't think possible to make sure that what He desires to happen will happen. There's also other divine intervention. The prophet Haggai will intervene to get the people to work on the temple as well, and not their own homes. Because in 520 BC, some folks then, as a result of the temple being slowed, well, I'll just work on my house instead. And so Haggai will confront them, and he'll say, the reason you have famine and the reason you have drought is because you're not being faithful to rebuild the temple. Remember, the temple is the central part of Jewish life. If you remember that from the previous lecture, that's why it had to be built first. It's the place where the heavens meet the earth. And so thus Haggai reminds them of Leviticus 26. If you follow me, if you obey me, this will lead to blessing, whereas disobedience will lead to destruction. And so Haggai emphasizes that their choices matter. How you choose to live matters. And so choose wisely by following Yahweh. And so there is a second call to go home, with a second return under Ezra in 458 BC. And we see this show up in Ezra chapter 7 through chapter 10. Now, Ezra is unique in that he is skilled in the study of the law of Moses. Artaxerxes declares that Judah can go home and that Ezra is to lead them. And so perhaps 5,000 Jews go, and Ezra reminds the people to follow the Mosaic law when he arrives by reading it. You might recall that in the case of the king in Deuteronomy 17, he was to make his own copy of the law, and then he was to read it often. Well, in the same way, the people are to know the law. Deuteronomy chapter 6 talks about this, of that it is to be on their minds. It is to be with them constantly. And so Ezra leads the people in a confession of their sins. Because one of the things they need to repent of is that there appear to be mixed marriages yet again in Ezra chapter 9, verses 1 to 2. And so as a result, this had led to idolatry in the past. And so the people agreed to repent and they divorced their foreign wives, as evidenced in Ezra chapter 10, verses 9 to 15. But that really wasn't the solution that Yahweh was after. He wasn't okay with their intermingling with these foreign wives, because of course He doesn't want His people to drift. Of course He doesn't. But He also doesn't favor divorce either. And so what this highlights is a change in attitudes. Because the exile moved the scriptures, the scribes, and strict obedience to them to the forefront of the Jewish mind. And so these things begin to replace the temple and the cultic rituals that go with the temple as the most important thing. Because you think about it, the people look and they're like, we went to Babylon for 70 years. Okay, we had to live somewhere else. Okay, and why did we have to live there? It's because we didn't worship God. We didn't hold to the scriptures. Well, we're not going to do that again. And so there became this deepened commitment to say, whatever we need to do, let's not let that happen again. Hence the commitment to the scribes, the scriptures, and subsequent things. Now, Ezra's leadership is going to deepen this change because there's an interpretive principle of letterism that begins to develop, where the language and the letters of the Torah are now considered holy. And so people stick to the letter of the law for fear of return to exile. Again, I don't want that to happen again, so I'm going to stick to the letter of the law. And for those of you, again, who are versed in the New Testament, you begin to say, who does that sound like? Sounds a lot like the Pharisees, who were very committed to the letter of the law. And so these attitudes and interpretive principles are reflected in the later attitudes of the scribes and the Pharisees. And this is again where, yes, the people should not have intermarried with these non-believers. Yet, divorce wasn't the option. The option is have these non-believing spouses follow God. And so again, we see where the people are sticking to the letter of the law instead of recognizing what might God want to do here. What might, again, quoting Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, what we intended for evil, what might God use for good here? And so the nation is going to go through moments like this, and we're going to see this in our next person, which is Nehemiah. Nehemiah will lead the third return 50 years after Ezra does. And prayer will mark the life of Nehemiah, a true layman. He will rebuild the wall that was stopped due to local opposition in Ezra chapter 4, while encountering opposition of his own. And so, in fact, it gets so intense that these guys are working on the walls, they're putting up bricks and stone with one hand, and then they have swords in the other. In spite of this, everything gets completed. And I tell you, Nehemiah's story is an amazing one because Nehemiah really is the everyman. He is right there underneath the king. He is worried. He doesn't want the Babylonian king to be worried about his position, to see his countenance. But the king notices something's up and he says, "What's wrong, Nehemiah?" Nehemiah says, and he didn't know what to say. And so he said, "God, give me the words to say." A quick prayer. And God does give him these words. And he says, "I'm just worried about my people. They're on my mind, and I wonder what's happening." And through this, the king says, "You know what, Nehemiah, you need to return. But not only that, you need to return and you need to restore these things." So, but if you're going to rebuild a wall, you're going to need some wood. You're going to need some stone. I got a wood guy. You can use my wood guy. I got a guy that does stone. You can have that too. And he is resourced by the king of Babylon. And so once again, we see when the wall is completed that God is not limited. God can use anyone to bring about his purposes. And once that wall is restored, Jerusalem can now be a city. It's also important to emphasize that this wall Why would a king rebuild a wall for a nation that he once conquered? You don't do that. Because guess what? If they get a wall, then now you've got to get through that wall again to reconquer these people. And yet we see that God, even in spite of this crazy situation, is restoring His people just as He promised to throughout the prophetic literature, which we will talk about in our last session. Once this is completed, Nehemiah has Ezra read the law in a 7-day marathon where the people commit to following the laws of Moses. I mean, hey, this looks good. And things appear to be going all right. And yet, just like in other things, Nehemiah 15 demonstrates that the people really aren't following Yahweh's commands. To begin with, Zerubbabel's reforms fall short, resulting in the temple being neglected and the priests working in the field. See, the Levites, they weren't supposed to work in the field. Their job was to work in the temple. Their job was for the people to work and them to provide the grain, them to provide the sacrifices, so the priests could focus on keeping the people right with God, so the priests could focus on the sacrifice and the temple cult. But yet, the people aren't giving. The people aren't taking care of that. And so the priests now have to work in the field. So we see this part of the law is not happening. The people are working on the Sabbath, illustrating that Ezra's reforms have fallen short. Again, the point of the Sabbath, or the Shabbat, again, the Hebrew word for rest, it was a day of rest. It was a day to break from your labors, which again, in the ancient world, is a big deal because what about my crops? What about my animals? What about these things? It was a day to let the people not only rest, but to trust that God would provide during that day of rest. But now the people are working on the Sabbath, and so we see that Ezra's reforms have fallen short. And even Nehemiah's walls, the walls that Nehemiah built, have now become markets for the Jews and the foreigners to sell their goods on the Sabbath. Because the foreigners rock up, they show up, they put their stuff next to the wall, and they begin to sell on the Sabbath. And not only them, but the Jews do as well. And so Nehemiah sees this, and he forcibly tries to get the people to follow the Sabbath. And he prays for God to understand. God, and he says, God, I'm trying to get these people to do it right. In fact, 3 times he says, please remember me for good, O God, my God. Please remember me for good. In other words, God, I tried. I did the best I could. And yet, what do we see here? And what we see is that the old habits of the nation are still there. That even in exile, yes, they were broken of their idolatry, but the following and the faithfulness to commitment to God's ways isn't what it could be. And in the same way, meanwhile, back in Babylon, something else is happening. And so there were actually Jews who did not follow God's call to return to Jerusalem. Why didn't they? Well, they were either comfortable, because, Babylon was a massive metropolitan city. It was a big deal in the ancient world. It was one of the great wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens. So they were either comfortable, because they're like, why am I going to leave this amazing city to go back to a city that's laid barren, doesn't even have a wall, that's laid barren for 70 years? I don't want to go back to that. I have comfort. I have accessibility here. And so they either had that, or they were financially successful in Babylon. It's like, God, I've got a great business here. I've got my spot. Why am I going to leave this and return to that? Why am I going to leave and go to a broken city? And so, what happens? Well, there's a king, all the while, who is in Babylon. And he's going to be central to our story. His name is Ahasuerus. And Ahasuerus is going to throw a party. But his Queen Vashti, isn't going to attend. And so he's going to become furious at Queen Vashti. And so he's going to say, I need to get a new queen. By the way, it's important to note, if you read the book of Esther, Ahasuerus is an interesting guy. He always seems to be drinking or always appears to love a party. He's always like, hey, let's have a party. Hey, let's have a drink. And you're going to see that show up as we talk about this, the story of Esther. So in his rage, he removes Vashti from her position and he looks for a replacement. And it's in this that we meet an unlikely heroine. Esther, a Jewish woman residing in Babylon, wins Ahasuerus' favor due to her great beauty. Yet she hides her Jewishness per the advice of her uncle Mordecai, also a Jew. Because again, it was like, well, let's just keep that under wraps just in case it's not so good. And so we see that unlike Daniel, Esther doesn't appear to be faithful to Yahweh because she breaks the law. Among other things, she has sex with a man who's not her husband, as referenced by Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. She has sex with Ahasuerus. She ends up marrying a pagan, because first she's in her harem, and then she's married. She marries a pagan, and she doesn't keep the dietary laws. She's eating the Babylonian food. But yet this, once again, does not limit God or who He can use. It's not like God is sitting there saying, hold on, Esther, I can't use you till you get all your ducks in the row. Hold on, Esther, I need you to clean up these bits of your life, and then I can use you. Because if we had to wait for God, if God had to wait on us to get our ducks in a row, to get our bits together, to be used for Him, then nothing would ever happen. God is willing to take Esther where she is and use her, and He does. And so in the midst of this, there is an unlikely turn of events. Esther's uncle Mordecai learns of a plot to assassinate Ahasuerus. He learns of some servants who are going to do this. And so he communicates it to Esther. And she communicates it to the king and thus saves his life. And so as a result, we see that Ahasuerus is preserved. But he doesn't realize that Mordecai is the one who does it. We'll come back to that. Ahasuerus, during this time, also promotes Haman as his highest official. Haman, by the way, is not a Babylonian, nor is he a Jew. We learn, too, that Haman is going to have an intense hatred for the Jews. And this is especially going to be for Mordecai, because when he is promoted, everyone bows, everyone reverences, gives him reverence, except for who? Mordecai. And this infuriates Haman, because he wants everyone to recognize him. So in turn, Haman starts to talk to the king, because he's like, how do I get back at Mordecai? So he in turn gets the king to sign an order that will annihilate those who do not follow the king's laws. Because he realizes not only Mordecai, but even the Jews, they don't really follow the king's laws. So how can I do this? That's how I'll get back at him. And so therefore, Haman looks to eradicate the Jews. It is an ancient Holocaust. He is looking to wipe things out. And of course, during this time, as Haman celebrates this law, Ahasuerus throws another party. Come on, all right, we signed this law. Yay, throw a party. But as the truth begins to emerge, we see that Esther steps up. Her uncle Mordecai implores her to reveal her past to save the Jews. In other words, he says, Esther, the only way that we can save our people, that we can save us, is for you to go before the king, for you to reveal who you are, and appeal to Ahasuerus' love for you. And so she goes and appeals to the king. And what's the best way to appeal to a king? To this king. Throw a party. And so that's exactly what she does. And she throws a party for the king, and she invites Haman as well. She says, I want you to come to this party because I want to share my heart. Well, Haman during this time is thinking, oh man, this party is for me. She's going to honor me. And so as part of his celebration, he builds this large gallows so that he can kill Mordecai on it. Because that'll be kind of like his celebration in addition to his celebration. And yet, once again, just as in the case with those who were rebuilding the wall, and who God showed up and provided for, in all the different ways in the Old Testament where God shows up in crazy ways, Ahasuerus has a sleepless night, and he can't seem to rest. And what better thing to do than to say, he tells his guys, well, just come read me the records. That'll put me to sleep. Not a bad plot. And while having the records read to him, he learns of Mordecai's heroics. He learns that Mordecai had found out about the plot to kill him. And so he decides, I'm going to honor him. And so he goes to Haman and he says, hey, I want to honor someone really special. What do you think I should do? And Haman thinks incidentally that it's about him. And he's like, oh yeah, you should do this and this and this. And he gives him a nice list. And then the king looks and says, great. Now go do that for Mordecai. And so in an ironic twist, Haman has to honor Mordecai. And this just makes Haman furious. And on top of this now, here comes the party. Esther's thrown her party, and here we go. And it's during this party that she reveals Haman's plot. She reveals, hey, I'm actually a Jew, and Haman wants to kill us. And this leads to Haman being hanged on the very gallows that he made for Mordecai. And so now that Haman is eliminated, it is time to tie things up, because it becomes apparent that Ahasuerus cannot reverse his decree. Even though Haman is dead, even though his plot has been found out, it is still a kingly decree. And so Esther and Mordecai talk with him and they come up with a solution. And the solution is for him to issue a counter decree where the Jews can defend themselves through military means. And so on that day, the Jews will kill Haman, his family, and all those who seek to oppose them. It is a way of fighting back through military means so that the Jews can escape this genocide. And it's a messy ending. It's meant to make us as the audience look and go, oh, God, is this really the way it should happen? And this is once again something we recognize because the name God isn't even mentioned in the entire text of Esther. And so this troubled the Jews because they began to wonder, well, is God in this? Can we even include this in our Hebrew Bible because Yahweh is not mentioned? But it was included because it is clear that God is at work saving His people. Even though He is not mentioned, it is clear that He is working behind the scenes. And so this is a literary judgment against those who stayed. This is a way of the writer letting his audience know these folks should not have stayed behind in Babylon. They should have left. They should have moved on. But they chose not to. But thankfully, God intervened and took care of His people because He loves them. And so this will wrap up the historical section of the Old Testament. This will end basically, as I talked about in that first session, we talked about the historical books as we started in Genesis and ended in Nehemiah with Esther tucked in at the end. This is it. We have now reached the end. We are now going to emerge into what's known as the intertestamental period, or the period between the testaments. And this will be our last discussion on historical things that happened before the Old Testament. And I look forward to sharing that with you in the next lecture. I'll see you there.